Jared Kushner stepped into the House Oversight Committee chamber that March morning with the kind of polished ease only years of elite grooming could produce. His tie was flawlessly knotted, his steps composed, his expression unreadable. He had every reason to feel invincible. Years of skating through power corridors with his family name as a golden key had taught him that the right tone and corporate phrasing could deflect almost anything. But what Kushner didn't yet know was that Jasmine Crockett had been preparing for this day like it was a final trial, and she didn't come to exchange pleasantries. She came to dismantle illusions. The room itself felt charged with a weighty silence before the hearing even began. The marble columns towered with gravitas, and the old oil portraits of former committee chairs seemed to glare down with expectations. Mahogany walls gleamed under the harsh fluorescence, catching every frown, every nervous twitch. C-SPAN's cameras stood sentinel in the corners, cold and unforgiving, ready to immortalize whatever unfolded. Every seat in the gallery was occupied, some by reporters eager for a headline, others by citizens who had waited hours for a front-row view of what was already whispered to be a reckoning. Jasmine Crockett, precise and poised, had arrived too, hours before the cameras ever rolled. Her navy blazer was crisp, her heels silent on the marble floor, and her folders, 3 of them, neatly color-coded, rested before her like weapons in a quiet war. While Kushner relied on inherited polish, Jasmine was fueled by decades of courtroom grit and investigative obsession. She had spent sleepless nights in her Dallas office combing through labyrinths of financial statements and dusty ledgers, piecing together a puzzle others had ignored or deliberately buried. Her dining table had been converted into a strategic war map, where dates, figures, and names were meticulously aligned. Yellow for discrepancies, blue for inconsistencies, red for full-blown contradictions. Jasmine didn't just believe something was wrong. She knew it, and she had the proof in black ink. When Kushner took his seat at the witness table, flanked by a trio of high-powered attorneys, the contrast was impossible to ignore. He carried himself like a man who had never been held accountable, who had always been given the benefit of the doubt before he even had to ask for it. His team whispered calmly, their confidence born not from truth, but from price tags and prestige. They'd faced plenty of hearings like this before, and won simply by speaking above the details and burying truth beneath jargon. But they hadn't faced Jasmine. As the chairman called the session to order, the room settled into a tension so thick it felt almost physical. The chairman's voice echoed through the chamber with the full authority of Article 1. Today's proceedings were not a courtesy review or a formality. They were a constitutional obligation to hold power to account, specifically power that had been wielded in ways that raised disturbing questions. The topic: federal contracting in the Middle East, under the previous administration, and whether positions in the White House had been misused to benefit private interests. Jared Kushner, senior advisor and son-in-law to the president, sat at the heart of it all. Kushner's opening statement began exactly as expected, 12 minutes of rehearsed language dressed in expensive vocabulary. Words like synergy, efficiency, and strategic alignment flowed effortlessly from his lips. He spoke of regional stability, of unlocking investment flows, of diplomacy reimagined. But none of it answered anything. It was a masterclass in obfuscation, language meant to impress, not inform. He spoke confidently, gesturing just enough to signal charm without crossing into arrogance. It was theater, pure and simple. And Jasmine, watching silently, had already filled pages of her legal pad, not with his points but with the evasions hidden between them. Then it was her turn. She didn't smile. She didn't soften her voice. She simply opened the first folder with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was about to do. "Mr. Kushner," she began, her voice calm but firm. "Let's talk about the Bahrain infrastructure project." Her tone had the sharp edge of precision. According to Treasury Department records, initial budgeting was $1.2 billion. Final expenditures totaled $2.8 billion. That's a $1.6 billion increase. Taxpayer dollars, Mr. Kushner. Can you explain line by line how that happened? The question didn't leave room for dancing. It wasn't speculative. It wasn't about theories or policy philosophies. It was numbers on a page. numbers paid by American citizens. And in that moment, for the first time that morning, Jared, Kushner hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. His response when it came was more guarded than before. Congresswoman, international development projects of this scale often experience necessary adjustments. Evolving on-the-ground dynamics required broader scope expansions, which delivered enhanced value and strategic outcomes. It was polished. It was textbook. And it was exactly the kind of language that Jasmine had heard 1,000 times before. An answer that sounded full, but meant nothing. Her eyes didn't blink. Her pen didn't stop moving. She leaned in slightly and let his words settle into the dead space of the room before slicing through them. Enhanced strategic value? She repeated, voice level. Let's be specific then. Treasury records indicate that $400 million, that additional funding was allocated to a firm called Middle East Development Solutions, a company formed 6 months before the contract was awarded. A company whose board, Mr. Kushner, includes your brother-in-law and a former business partner. Would you call that a coincidence? A beat passed, then another. The lawyers behind him suddenly stopped whispering. Kushner's face didn't move at first, but his silence told a story louder than words ever could. Behind him, his attorneys exchanged sidelong glances, their previously composed demeanors tightening into a quiet alert. One of them leaned forward slightly, as though ready to interject. But Kushner gave a subtle flick of his hand. Don't. He still believed he could manage this himself, still held on to the illusion that confidence and connections could shield him. He lifted his chin slightly and began to speak. Congresswoman, the procurement process was handled in full accordance with all federal guidelines. Due diligence was conducted, and the necessary checks were followed without exception. The implication that something improper occurred is both inaccurate and disrespectful to the professionals who worked diligently on this initiative. But the tone had shifted. There was a nervous edge clinging to his phrasing now, the kind that couldn't be ironed out no matter how much media training or PR polish one might have. His voice was still even, but the confidence had gone brittle at the edges. He was no longer steering the room, he was bracing against its current. Jasmine didn't flinch. Her voice remained steady, unhurried. She reached for the second folder and opened it with the composure of a surgeon prepping for an incision. A moment passed. Then she held up a piece of paper to the cameras, making sure the official White House seal and Kushner's signature were plainly visible. Mr. Kushner, she said, this memorandum signed by you and dated 14 months ago asserts that Middle East Development Solutions had been fully vetted by the General Services Administration and deemed eligible for federal contracts. Would you still stand by this statement under oath? He nodded slowly, eyes narrowing slightly. I would. That memo was based on internal assurances provided to me at the time. Interesting, Jasmine replied, her voice now with the faintest glimmer of steel, because GSA records obtained through official channels show no trace of any such vetting ever occurring prior to your signature. In fact, the company didn't even appear in the contractor database until 3 weeks after your memo was submitted. A.N. Ripple moved through the room, not loud but palpable. Journalists scribbled faster. Someone in the gallery audibly gasped. Even the marble and mahogany seemed to close in tighter around Kushner, like the room itself was narrowing. He adjusted his tie. There are often delays in GSA database updates, particularly with companies operating in multiple jurisdictions. The documentation may have been in process. Or non-existent, Jasmine cut in, her tone never rising, never theatrical. Because there's more. She pulled out another sheet. The company's listed business address, according to its Delaware registration, is a UPS store. Mailbox number 4847, North Market Street, Wilmington. She let that hang in the air for a beat. That same mailbox, Mr. Kushner, is tied to 12 other corporations, all of which received federal contracts during your tenure, totaling over $800 million combined. The room was still like a church during a funeral. 12 companies. One mailbox. Kushner's jaw visibly clenched. His attorneys shifted again, this time more anxiously. They hadn't prepared for this level of documentation, this precision strike of fact over rhetoric. One leaned in toward him again, whispering, urgently this time, but he dismissed them once more with a twitch of the wrist. Jasmine raised the stack of incorporation papers, flipping through them just enough to show the repetition. Can you help us understand this pattern? Can you explain to the American people why 12 different entities receiving federal money are all connected to a single UPS store mailbox, and why many of them list close associates of yours, relatives, and former business partners as board members? For the first time, Kushner visibly swallowed. The performance was beginning to falter. He tried to regain footing with complexity. Congresswoman, you're conflating administrative convenience with intentional wrongdoing. It's not unusual for startup entities to share mailboxes for routing correspondence. And these entities, while affiliated through broader infrastructure initiatives, operated independently and followed the standard channels of review. But the words were tumbling faster now, and as they did, the illusion started to break. The slickness that had cloaked his earlier responses was slipping, like a mask peeling away under heat. Jasmine's pen never stopped moving. Then she slid her hand over to the third folder, thicker than the first two combined. The impact of its weight against the desk was subtle but unmistakable. Mr. Kushner, she said, calm as ever. This final set of documents contains a chain of emails acquired legally through court-approved methods. They're from your personal Gmail account. That statement alone drew a collective intake of breath. The room knew what was coming next. These emails are between you and your brother-in-law, Michael Boulos. The subject, the Bahrain Initiative. In one message, dated just before the project's budget was expanded, you refer to, and I quote, keeping the family business considerations front and center. In another, you discuss maximizing post-administration opportunities. She didn't embellish. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The evidence had begun to speak for itself. Kushner's eyes darted, toward his lawyers, toward the cameras, back toward Jasmine. The tight smile he'd worn earlier had vanished. In its place, a nervous twitch at the corner of his mouth. Sweat had begun to gather at his temples. The air conditioning hadn't changed, but he had. The room was silent, dead silent. Only the soft clicking of camera shutters filled the stillness, documenting every microsecond of unraveling. Then Jasmine posed the question that would tilt the hearing from challenging to catastrophic. Mr. Kushner? She said, her voice low but cutting. While serving as a senior advisor in the White House, were you using your position to arrange future business ventures that would benefit your family? His mouth opened and no answer came. Not right away. Not for the next long, devastating 47 seconds. Time dilated inside the chamber. 47 seconds isn't long in most contexts, but under the glare of political scrutiny, with cameras rolling and history scribbling in real time, it felt eternal. Jared Kushner's face stiffened, his mouth open like a man on the verge of words he no longer knew how to shape. His hands, previously so composed, gripped the edge of the table, knuckles whitening under pressure. His lawyers were no longer whispering. They were frozen too, realizing simultaneously that they had lost control of the room and perhaps the narrative. Jasmine Crockett sat still, eyes locked on him, unflinching. She'd learned long ago that silence could be a scalpel. You didn't always need to strike with words. Sometimes the absence of speech cut deeper. Kushner, surrounded by pedigree now useless, began to unravel. The audience, the press, even the committee members seemed to collectively lean forward in their seats. A political dynasty heir, paralyzed by a question too simple to deflect, too damning to answer. When he finally spoke, the damage had already taken root. In the context of those communications, he began, stammering. There were family discussions that, when isolated, may seem misleading, but we maintained clear ethical boundaries between our roles in government and private. He trailed off. His voice, normally smooth and fortified with prepared lines, cracked like porcelain. The phrase ethical boundaries hung limp in the air, robbed of weight by the very evidence that now surrounded him in physical folders and printed emails. His corporate dialect was failing. His words, once honed by consultants and media coaches, now sounded like a lifeline stretched too thin to hold. Jasmine didn't blink. She reached forward and removed one final document from the thick third folder, one single page this time. And even from across the room, its presence felt different. The paper was heavier, the formatting more formal. Her fingers touched it like evidence in a criminal trial. Careful, deliberate. Mr. Kushner, she said with a tone that carried not just gravity, but the unmistakable ring of finality. Do you understand the concept of fiduciary duty? The question was deceptively simple, a gift almost, something he could latch onto, something familiar. He straightened in his chair, trying to reclaim some of the confidence he had lost. Of course, he said, his voice marginally steadier. Fiduciary duty means acting in the best interests of those who rely on your decision-making. It's a foundational principle of both law and ethical governance. And that was the setup Jasmine had been waiting for. She leaned in just a little. Not for effect, but because the moment demanded closeness, clarity. As a senior White House advisor with significant influence over international contracts and federal decision-making, she said, her words deliberate, to whom did you owe that fiduciary duty? He didn't hesitate this time. To the American people, to the taxpayers who fund our government and depend on ethical leadership. He said it like he believed it, or maybe he needed to believe it in that moment, to convince himself that he could still wear the mask of integrity, even as it cracked, in real time. Then Jasmine slid the final paper into full view of the cameras. This email, she said, holding it up, was sent from your personal Gmail account to David Miller at Blackstone, 3 weeks before the Bahrain contract expansion was finalized. The subject line reads, Transition Positioning Confidential. The air fell out of the room. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. The sentence alone felt like a dropped match in a room soaked with gasoline. Jasmine began to read. David, the $2.8 billion commitment is locked in following this morning's NSC meeting. Post-January, our leverage will increase due to the infrastructure relationships we've put in place. The family office should begin preparing acquisition strategies immediately for the entities we discussed. This must remain between us until the transition is complete. Opportunities will be substantial if we position correctly. Signed, Jared. She lowered the paper. The silence that followed was more deafening than any shouting match could have ever been. Jared's posture crumbled. His mouth opened, then closed again. Behind him, one of the lawyers finally broke composure and leaned in to whisper something hurriedly. Jared didn't seem to hear. His eyes were darting now side to side, unfocused, as though searching the room for an exit that didn't exist. And then Jasmine asked the question that closed the trap. Given the fiduciary responsibility you just defined, she said, her voice soft but cutting, can you explain how this email serves anyone other than your family's private financial interests? A low sound escaped from his throat, an aborted response. He tried to speak, forming incomplete phrases. That communication, the context, it's not reflective of when the intentions, executive privilege may apply. The rest was unintelligible. Broken syntax, false starts, Technical jargon spun so clumsily it collapsed before it could even take form. The mask was gone. No more polished delivery. No more deflections. No more prepared statements. Only a man, caught between the weight of truth and the wreckage of deception. The cameras kept rolling. And Jasmine? She didn't gloat, didn't smile. She simply waited. Because sometimes you don't need to press the knife further. Sometimes it's enough to let silence do the work. Seconds stretched like minutes. Jared Kushner sat at the witness table, not as the influential White House advisor or the polished businessman he had carefully projected for years, but as a man exposed. His hands trembled slightly as they clutched. The polished wood, white-knuckled and unmoving. The glossy exterior had shattered. What remained was someone unprepared for genuine accountability, someone who had spent a lifetime guarded by name, wealth, and association, now standing alone, in the one place where none of those could shield him from truth. Jasmine Crockett remained motionless, her eyes locked on his. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't press. Her silence was louder than any demand could have been. She had learned, over years in courtrooms filled with lies and leverage, that when a person is cracked wide open, you don't interrupt the fall. You let gravity finish the work. Kushner opened his mouth again, lips dry, searching for another escape hatch. In the broader context, there were layers of review that, nothing was done. Not formally, it wasn't a breach, not intentionally. But the words failed him again. They were limp. His voice quivered like a man reaching for a rope that had already snapped. Behind him, his legal team had fallen completely silent. No more whispers. No more note passing. Just 3 attorneys realizing in real time that their client had entered a free fall, and there was no climbing back. The chamber was still. Dozens of gallery members were frozen mid-breath. Reporters, fingers poised above keys, watched as the climax they'd sensed all morning unfolded in real time. A man who had orchestrated billion-dollar deals, stood beside heads of state, and shaped policy for a global superpower, now fumbled over his own thoughts, unable to defend a single damning email that he himself had written. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to, and as the seconds ticked by, 10, 20, 30, the silence took on mass. It felt like a presence in the room. The kind of silence that squeezes the air out of your lungs. That doesn't wait for applause or acknowledgement. That simply exists, because truth doesn't need help to make itself heard. Kushner looked down, at the table. For the first time, he couldn't meet her eyes. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, finally breaking the stillness. Her voice was nearly a whisper, but it carried like a bell in a cathedral. Earned, 1 word, 1 syllable. 7 letters that detonated louder than any indictment ever could. It wasn't an insult. It wasn't a grandstanding accusation. It was a statement of fact. And it landed with the weight of everything that had just happened. Every folder, every document, every dollar misused. Earned. The room exhaled as if the very walls had been holding their breath. Kushner's face drained of all color. His lips moved silently, but he said nothing. Not a single rebuttal. Not a denial. Because there was nothing left to say. 47 seconds. That's how long he sat in silence after Jasmine had read the email. 47 seconds that stretched across every major news outlet. 47 seconds that would loop endlessly on television, social media, and political commentary. The man who had inherited everything, connections, wealth, proximity to power, had nothing left but silence when asked a simple question. Who benefits from your decisions? And the answer, now captured forever, in high definition, was not the American people. As the chairman called for a brief recess, reporters flooded out of the room like a wave. Phones came up to faces. Live streams ignited. Headlines were already being drafted mid-stride. Phrases like political reckoning, defining moment, and collapse under oath filled press pools and group chats. Kushner sat motionless, staring into the distance, the same way a man might stare at the ocean after the wave has already crashed. His lawyers stood behind him, murmuring options, exit strategies, damage control, possible legal consequences. But Kushner didn't seem to hear them. He was still trapped in that one word. Earned. It echoed in his ears louder than Jasmine's voice ever had, because it wasn't a political jab. It was a moral judgment. The summation of everything he wasn't. Meanwhile, Jasmine quietly closed her folders. She didn't celebrate. Didn't flash a triumphant look or indulge in the moment. That wasn't her style. She gathered her materials the same way she had arranged them, methodically, precisely, without fuss. To her, this wasn't personal. It was necessary. A correction. A realignment of the imbalance that privilege had long shielded from consequence. As she stood, a staffer approached her with a phone buzzing in their hand. Messages were already pouring in. Media requests, interviews, speaking invitations. But Jasmine didn't react to any of it. She glanced at her notes, slid her folders into her briefcase, and nodded to the staffer with practiced calm. Because this wasn't about a viral moment. This was about principle, about ensuring the people entrusted with power were made to answer for how they wielded it. And today, one of the most protected men in America had been made to answer not with words but with silence. Outside the chamber, the ripple effects began almost immediately. Cable news hosts scrambled to reframe coverage, cutting away from other segments to air the hearing on loop. Social media exploded with commentary from all corners of the political spectrum. Memes, transcripts, video clips, each carrying that devastating moment where Kushner choked on his own contradictions. And always, beneath it, the word that made it all collapse. Earned. It wasn't a slogan, it wasn't a campaign, it was truth. The kind of truth that cuts through polished party lines and privilege, and once it's spoken, it doesn't fade. The tremors from that one word, earned, spread far beyond the wood-paneled hearing room. Within minutes, every major news network cut to the moment. Some played it in full, not daring to add commentary. Others looped it with slow-motion reaction, shots. Kushner's tightening grip on the table, the tightening of his jaw, the dawning realization that not even the most expensive lawyers in D.C. could explain this one away. Anchors, stunned, stumbled through live reactions, some simply repeating Jasmine Crockett's name as if trying to process what had just happened. Social media ignited like dry brush to flame. On Twitter, earned shot to the top of trending charts, globally within 20 minutes. Clips of the 47 seconds of silence began circulating with a speed reserved for only the most seismic political moments. TikTok users turned it into slow-burning edits. YouTubers started live streams just to analyze Jasmine's strategy. News aggregators blasted notifications to millions of phones across the country. Kushner crumbles under oath, leaves room. Speechless after 47 seconds of silence. And it wasn't just the left cheering. Journalists from conservative outlets, some of whom had previously given Kushner the benefit of the doubt, openly admitted the gravity of what had just unfolded. One editorial board member wrote, "You can prepare statements, you can rehearse lines, but you cannot fake integrity. Not in that room. Not when someone like Crockett is sitting across from you with facts sharpened into weapons." Within hours, the hearing had shifted from congressional routine to cultural reckoning. That email Jasmine read, its cold calculation, its blatant self-interest, had already been verified and cross-referenced by legal watchdogs and government ethics scholars. And it was damning. No interpretation needed, just lines on a page, signed with Jared Kushner's name, that turned political optics into prosecutable evidence. Inside the Justice Department, heads turned. What had been an inquiry before was now potentially a referral for federal prosecution. Jasmine's team had done more than ask questions. They had laid out a paper trail that pointed directly to personal enrichment using public office, violations not just of ethics, but of federal law. Prosecutors weren't wondering if they would investigate further. They were already drafting subpoenas. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett declined every immediate interview. Her office released a short statement. Congresswoman Crockett believes that facts, not personalities, must guide oversight. Her focus remains on ensuring transparency, accountability, and justice for the American people. No gloating, no spin, just a reaffirmation of purpose. But the public didn't need spin to be moved. They had witnessed something rare, a powerful man protected by layers of privilege and influence, forced to answer not just to law, but to truth. And when truth came for him, he had no words. Editorial boards scrambled to respond. The Washington Post ran a headline the next morning. One word, a nation listening. The New York Times called it a masterclass in accountability. Even the Wall Street Journal, often cautious in tone, acknowledged in their coverage. In those 47 seconds of silence, the balance of political power momentarily shifted, not with fury, but with fact. Kushner's team, reeling, attempted damage control. A hastily assembled press release cited, taken out of context emails, coincidental overlaps, and administrative misinterpretations. But no one was buying it. The image was already imprinted in the national psyche. A man born into wealth and married into power, rendered mute by a public servant armed only with documentation and the moral weight of her oath. The legal fallout began almost immediately. Ethics offices issued preliminary reviews. Congressional aides confirmed that a formal referral to the Department of Justice was being prepared. Investigative journalists unearthed companion documents, confirming that the mailbox in Wilmington had indeed been used for at least 9 other companies involved in federal contracts, all linked in some way to Kushner's circle. The pattern was no longer theory. It was real, and the law was closing in. But beyond the procedural, something deeper stirred. Americans watching from their kitchens, buses, and break rooms saw something they hadn't expected. Proof that even those at the very top could be made to answer, not by force, not by spectacle, but by calm, unrelenting truth. College professors rewrote lesson plans overnight. Law schools added Jasmine's hearing to their ethics curriculum. Leadership workshops incorporated her line of questioning as a case study in strategy and emotional control. Political science classes paused to replay the moment again and again, dissecting how a single word, delivered without flourish, had cut through decades of inherited immunity. And then came the stories. People across the country began sharing their own experiences of being told they hadn't earned what they'd worked for. Single mothers juggling 2 jobs, veterans overlooked for promotions, first-generation college grads doubted at every turn. They identified not with power but with Jasmine's quiet, resolute stance. The idea that you had to earn it, that some people coasted while others clawed, had found its personification. Jasmine, in that moment, wasn't just a congresswoman. She became a vessel for the unspoken frustrations of millions who had played by the rules only to watch others rewrite them in their favor. Her silence became theirs, her precision, their justice. The ripple wasn't just political, it was emotional, cultural, generational. Parents told their children the story. Activists posted tributes. Artists painted. In the hours that followed the hearing, a quiet storm began brewing behind the scenes, one that would move faster than anyone expected. By the end of the day, multiple federal watchdog groups had filed formal complaints with the Office of Government Ethics. The email Jasmine had read on record, the one from Kushner to David Miller, was already being dissected by attorneys across Washington. The language was too precise, too strategic, too deliberate to be passed off as misinterpretation. It was to many the clearest signal yet of intent to convert public power into private gain, and the Department of Justice was listening. At 6:17 p.m., a DOJ spokesperson released a terse, calculated statement. "We are aware of today's hearing testimony and the evidence presented. The department takes all allegations of misuse of federal office seriously. At this time, we are initiating a preliminary review." The word review might have sounded mild, but for those who understood the cadence of federal investigations, it was the siren of the next phase: subpoenas, interrogatories, and the slow tightening of legal scrutiny. Jasmine had done what few could. She hadn't just humiliated someone in power. She'd forced the system to act. By nightfall, late shows were opening with clips from the hearing. Journalists broke down every gesture, every pause, every eye, movement in that 47-second silence. Analysts debated whether Kushner had committed a crime or merely obliterated his credibility. But even in disagreement, there was consensus. Something fundamental had shifted. The hearing wasn't just political theater. It had exposed a culture of entitlement that, for years, had evaded any real consequence. In living rooms across America, people didn't just talk about Jasmine Crockett. They stood a little taller because of her. She had walked into that room with nothing but facts, law, and unshakable resolve. And she had left with a nation watching. Not because she sought attention, but because she made truth visible in a place where it's often cloaked in doublespeak. Back in D.C., Kushner's team was panicking. That evening, legal advisors huddled behind closed doors in a Georgetown townhouse, the air thick with whispered blame and contingency planning. They knew they couldn't erase the email. They couldn't spin the optics. They were cornered by the worst kind of opponent. One with documentation and public trust on her side. One who hadn't raised her voice yet had shattered a legacy with surgical calm. Inside federal agencies, the reaction was just as intense. Auditors at the GSA began pulling records late into the night, cross-referencing contractor databases and flagged entities that shared that infamous mailbox on North Market Street. The pattern was undeniable. More than a dozen companies had registered at that location, all within a narrow time frame, all tied, either through board seats, investors, or legal representation, to individuals within Kushner's network. What Jasmine had uncovered wasn't just an anomaly, it was a method. At CNN headquarters, producers debated whether to label the hearing a scandal or a revelation. One finally settled on both. By midnight, a special report titled "The 47-Second Collapse, Jared Kushner and the Rise" of earned accountability aired across the nation. It was narrated with the gravitas of a historical event because in many ways it was. Meanwhile, Jasmine stayed silent. She returned to her apartment just after 10:30 p.m., exhausted but composed. Her staff had offered to bring her to a hotel to avoid the press mob outside her D.C. residence, but she declined. "I didn't do anything special," she told her chief of staff quietly. "I just did my job." She didn't sleep that night. Not because of stress, but because her inbox wouldn't stop filling, not with congratulations from pundits, but with letters from ordinary Americans. Emails from teachers in Alabama, single parents in Oregon, a first-generation student in New Jersey. All of them said the same thing. "Thank you for speaking for us." She read every single one. And outside her apartment building, someone taped a handwritten sign to the wall: "Truth doesn't need to shout when it's earned." By the next morning, the consequences began to solidify. Congressional leadership from both parties called for an ethics investigation into federal contracting practices linked to the Bahrain deal. Speaker after speaker on the House floor referenced Jasmine's hearing. Some tried to downplay it as a partisan attack, but most, including centrists and even a few moderate conservatives, couldn't deny what they'd seen. A government official, frozen under the weight of his own words, unable to defend actions that reeked of self-dealing. The phrase, "transition positioning confidential," had become infamous overnight. Legal scholars began debating whether the email constituted a violation of the emoluments clause. Others cited potential breaches of the Hatch Act. But the most damning commentary came from a former federal prosecutor on MSNBC, who said plainly, "That email is what prosecutors call a roadmap, and Jasmine just read it on national television." Blackstone, the firm mentioned in the email, issued a statement by mid-morning distancing itself from Kushner's comments and clarifying that David Miller had no knowledge of any communications regarding post-administration strategies. But it was too late. The damage had spread. Journalists were already chasing other names mentioned in the document: Michael Boulos, Charles Ornstein, trying to uncover just how far the planning had gone and how many contracts had been leveraged for what appeared to be a private playbook. Inside the White House, no official statement was made, but insiders reported tension. Emails began circulating internally warning staff to avoid speaking to the press. One senior aide reportedly muttered, "This isn't just a hearing anymore, it's a reckoning," and it was only getting started. In the days that followed, it was no longer about Kushner. It was about something far bigger. The hearing had cracked open a conversation the country had been avoiding for years. Not just about ethics or corruption, but about the silent weight of privilege. The inherited kind. The bought kind. The kind that slips through back doors and uses polished language to mask intention. Jasmine Crockett's question had punctured all of it with one word: earned. And the word would not go away. It was scrawled across cardboard signs held up at city halls, printed on t-shirts worn at college rallies, painted across the sides of brick buildings by artists who didn't need commissions to feel inspired. Earned became more than a slogan. It became a reckoning, a cultural mirror. People began using it in conversations not about politics, but about workplaces, about nepotism, about leadership and legacy. One viral post read, "Nepotism gives you a seat. But if you can't answer a question without stammering in front of 300 million people, you didn't earn the table." And there was Jared Kushner, captured in that moment. Silent, sweating, eyes darting, unraveling under the simplest of questions. There were no more op-eds defending him. No strategists spinning the silence. No family surrogates publicly speaking on his behalf. Even the echo chamber of influencers and loyalists couldn't generate a convincing alternate version of what had been witnessed in full public view. You couldn't retouch 47 seconds of dead silence. You couldn't edit your way out of a real-time collapse. Within a week, a federal ethics probe was launched. Within 2, subpoenas landed at multiple addresses: Delaware and corporation offices, Washington consultancies, and Kushner's own firm. The mailbox on North Market Street was now infamous. Every company linked to it came under scrutiny. Journalists published maps and diagrams, drawing red lines connecting board members, business, partners, and relatives. The web was wider than anyone expected. Shell companies, overlapping directorships, timelines that aligned too neatly with policy decisions made inside the West Wing. The Justice Department confirmed that the preliminary review had escalated into a formal investigation. But while the legal machinery turned its gears, the cultural aftershock was what truly changed things. Colleges and universities began revising syllabi. In law classes, Jasmine's questioning became a case study in applied accountability. In ethics seminars, her silence was dissected as a strategic device. In communications programs, her cadence was analyzed for its unflinching clarity. Political scientists coined it the Crockett method, a blend of documentary evidence, prosecutorial, focus, and surgical delivery. But Jasmine never sought fame. When invited onto primetime interviews, she declined. She issued only one statement. Accountability is not a performance, it's a duty, and it is a privilege to fulfill it in service of the American people. In contrast, Kushner began to disappear, first from public events, then from speaking engagements, and eventually from headlines altogether. He was no longer the polished bridge between politics and business that donors once bragged about. He was now a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when confidence isn't backed by character, when opportunity is confused for merit, when power is inherited but not respected. The moment came full circle at a private panel months later. Jasmine was invited to speak to a group of graduating law students. She didn't want a stage. She asked to sit in a circle, just chairs, eye to eye. The students asked her how she stayed composed that day, how she kept her voice steady, her expression calm, her pen moving even as power trembled across from her. She smiled softly and said, "Because I wasn't speaking to him. I was speaking to every young woman told her voice is too sharp. Every public defender told their facts won't matter. Every American who's had to earn what others are simply handed. I wasn't there to win. I was there to remind him that we see him, and that we remember everything." The room was still and someone whispered, "That word, it meant everything." Jasmine nodded. "It's not just about privilege," she said. "It's about responsibility. Power means nothing if you didn't carry the weight to deserve it. Anyone can wear a title. Not everyone can withstand truth." The investigation into Kushner would go on for years. There would be court dates, depositions, and perhaps more headlines. But what happened in that chamber had already outlived the news cycle. It had become mythic, not in a grandiose way, but in the way stories are passed down, not for their spectacle, but for their lesson. And that lesson was simple. If you want trust, you must earn it. If you want to serve, you must serve with integrity. If you want power, you must answer to it. That March day in Washington didn't just mark the collapse of a political figure's reputation. It redefined what the country should expect from those in power. It reminded a generation that silence can be justice. That one person, prepared and principled, can make an empire of excuses collapse in under a minute. The mahogany walls of the Oversight Committee chamber have seen generations of hearings, some furious, some forgettable. But few would be remembered like the one where Jared Kushner went silent and Jasmine Crockett whispered a word that sounded more like a verdict than a comment. Earned, not shouted, not framed for applause, just spoken. And in that stillness, something changed, not just in